We shall think now of a very remote past, of a poetically speaking, a time before time itself. We will focus now on what is known as the Indo-European culture, which has been the cornerstone, for example, of most languages spoken today in Earth, from Spanish to Russian, from English to Hindi, all coming from the same language family which can be traced back to what a group of humans spoke in the steppes of Eurasia millennia ago. Now, the Indo-European people themselves were originally a nomadic people and moved from their heartlands of Central Asia to the east, India and Persia, and the west, Italy and Greece. And with their language, which served naturally as a vehicle for fiction creation, they also brought their collective myths, their culture. The Indo-European, also known as Aryan migration, completely transformed India, Italy, and Greece. By conquering and/or mixing with the aboriginal populations, they brought with them their ancient beliefs about life, death, family, morality, and the divine. These beliefs mostly revolved around a very old form of tribal religion, older than any cult of the Olympian gods or the Roman pantheon, and certainly older than any philosophical notion of a universal divinity. This primitive religion centered around two pillars: the worship of the dead and the sacred fire. These, especially the belief in the divinity of fire, probably formed during the time when most of humanity was still living under nomadic existence. It is likely that the dead were worshipped since time immemorial, not only by Homo sapiens, but by other human species. There's evidence of many Neanderthal burials, such as this one found in La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, which probably implies the existence of funerary rites, or at least some sort of concept of the afterlife or respect for the dead held by sapiens and our closest hominid cousins. As for fire, it is likely that other species of hominids such as Neanderthals, Erectus and Ergaster also came to dominate it, and probably were mesmerized by the hypnotic beauty displayed by the flames and also by its power as an element for cooking, warmth, shelter, and keeping other wild animals away. We can imagine that fire could have been seen as a divine representation, even a persona, and we know for sure that ancient Indo-Europeans worshipped fire, even after leaving nomadic lifestyle and settling. So why did the ancient religion of these Proto-Indo-Europeans center around fire and the dead? One can hypothesize that perhaps due to isolation and the lack of bigger, more complex social structures and economical surplus, humanity in these said regions of Indo-European presence didn't yet develop a more sophisticated way of understanding life, death, and the idea of the supernatural into a universal deity, justified with theological philosophy. Whatever the reason, the issue here is how they worshipped the sacred fire and the dead, and what did it mean to them as society-building myths. After settling in Italy and Greece, probably being a slow migratory process lasting from 2000 BC to 1600 BC, the populations there developed a cult of fire which came to be known as Vesta in Latin or Hestia in Greek. It came to be a god in its own right, often personified in a female form. This Vesta or sacred fire burned in every home of Greece and Italy, that is, in those families who kept religion as their heritage. We will discuss this issue about heritage later, for this is the basis of nobility. Fire, which in nomadic times had been a symbol of warmth and protection, came to be the center of the primitive Greco-Italian tribal religious cult, and thus to represent a sedentary way of life in which the fire was never moved away and always kept burning. Houses to host their sacred Vesta were eventually built out of stone, which lasts way longer than other less strong materials. And the altar of Vesta, which was the burning fire itself, came to be located at the center of the house. The cult of Vesta, inherited from the Aryan people, would eventually weaken by losing importance to the Olympian cult and other Hellenistic religions. But its complete extinction would only come after Christianity. Vesta was a chaste, virgin, and pure fire, conceived as an ever-burning flame to represent the moral force within humans. As Ovid describes it in his poem Fasti, conceive of Vesta as naught but the living flame, and you see that no bodies are born of flame. Rightly, therefore, is she a virgin who neither gives nor takes seeds, and she loves companions in her virginity. The worship of the dead in Greece and Italy centered around a very old notion about the soul and death itself, inherited from the Indo-European tradition. We should remove the idea that ancient Greeks and Italians started out worshipping Zeus, Athena, Hera, or Aphrodite from their early beginnings. These notions of divinity were actually very modern and came to be an innovation that allowed people of distinct families to worship whichever god they pleased, universal and open to all. The Aryan people who migrated to Greece, Italy, and India shared the common belief that body and soul were a single indissoluble entity. The deceased would continue to be after their death and would physically continue to live in their grave. After death, men themselves would become gods and were worshipped as divinities. Not Zeus, not Hera, not Aphrodite. In the earliest stages of Greco-Roman civilization, people worshipped their own ancestors, and only theirs as gods. This is a very important feature in the development of the ancient West, because it will mean that these Olympian gods associated with natural phenomena would come much later, and that in its origin, religion was a domestic, private thing, and not a universal matter. Thus, some men would be venerated as gods after their death, and would be known as demons, heroes, lares, and manes. These divine beings were men immortalized by the memory of the living, and were highly demanding deities, constantly requiring food and sacrifice. So, we see a worship of the dead, which made it highly important for each house to have their ancestors buried within its grounds or family estates, in order to feed them and offer sacrifice. Milk, honey, and food were literally placed on top of the tomb of the deceased, so they could drink and be fed. In these early stages of civilization, not yet was there a heavenly place for good souls versus a hell or purgatory for the wicked and evil. Nor was reincarnation ever a strong belief in Greece and Italy. Rather, the physical presence of the dead came to be the defining feature of this cult. Doing sacrifice and pleasing the gods, which were the family's very own ancestors, meant that there was a sort of contract between the dead and the living. The dead granted protection, and the living granted them food, milk, wine, and sacrifices. It all seemed very utilitarian, a far cry from the Christian notion of a benevolent and loving God that wants nothing from us but faith. These ancient demons, heroes, genii, and lares wanted sacrifice, and if they didn't get it, the contract with the living would be broken and divine protection would be lost. The Aryans who migrated east to India also seem to have shared this idea of human post-mortem existence. The Laws of Manu speak about the Sraddha, a Sanskrit word referring to an act of faith, especially devoted to honor the ancestors and pray for their intercession. We can see that in several books of the Laws of Manu. When the Sraddha is done according to the rites, the ancestors of he who offers food experience an inalterable satisfaction. As ridiculous as all of this may seem now, believing your dead ancestors physically lived in a grave and needed food and beverages, and that the fire burning in your living room is actually a god representing a morally pure entity. This was genuinely believed to be true at the dawn of history in Greece and Italy, and this is what constituted an entity we will study in depth, the ancient tribal family, also known in Greek as genos, and in Latin as gens. Now, the elements, rites, and tradition of this primitive cult is what came to be the religion of the family, which we can also call the domestic religion. This religion, unlike more recent innovations such as the worship of the Olympian gods, the cult of Mithras, or Christianity, wasn't open to all human beings, nor were all individuals treated as equal under its norms. This religion was preserved only to the members of a specific family, of a lineage, and it wasn't a proselytist cult. It wasn't looking actively for new members. Membership, in fact, only came from blood, adoption, or religious submission through clientship. This early form of religion is probably what gave social coherence and served as the common fiction which bounded together the groups of nomadic peoples, gathering around a fire and burying the dead. In sedentary life, the ancient Greeks and Italians practiced it in every house, which hosted both the Vesta and its interior and the tomb of the ancestors, somewhere inside its surrounding estates. This religion looked inwards, not to the divinity in nature or other abstract outward concept, but in the divine force that was perceived to exist within every man. represented by the fire of Vesta. The father was the priest of this family cult. Every family ought to have a father, in Latin, pater familias, a masculine life-giving figure through which the cult was received and through which it would go on indefinitely, only through and by him. We can imagine then thousands of gods worshipped by these clan groups of which we might never know their names, since they were not shared but instead kept secretly and zealously inside each family. Even the sacrifices in this religion were known in Latin as sacrificia occulta, hidden sacrifices, according to Cicero in his De Haruspicum Responsis. And the highest virtue was not, as some more recent religions claim, faith or good actions, but keeping tradition completely intact. What was received from the fathers must be kept without any changes. The mixture of secrecy, closeness, keeping tradition intact at the expense of any theological debate, the father as a priest, the house as a temple, and having as many gods as one family's ancestry could count, gives us a very clear image of what this primitive religion was like in ancient Greece and ancient Italy, and how it doesn't resemble more modern notions of divinity and religious congregation. Religion itself was the private property of each family, its unique heritage, and it needed not to be shared. Of the many small altars found in Pompeii, some of them contain small statuettes of what could represent Olympian gods or mystery cult divinities, but some of them might also represent these old family gods, deified ancestors, lares, genii, manes, demons, and heroes. Naturally, 79 AD took place in a period in which this religion had lost most of its strength and political relevance, since the imperial age of Rome was the age of the prevalence of the cults of the emperor, of Mithras, of Sol, and of course of Jesus Christ, where you could pretty much shop for the god you wanted, and the individual was much freer to choose according to their conscience and not under the burden of maintaining tradition in a closed entity as the family. But if we look closely at these family altars, we can still see how this ancient domestic religion echoed through the centuries and how relevant it was for the constitution of the Western civilization. Of course, we will go further back in time, back when this family religion was indeed the force behind the constitution of human groups in Greece and Italy, and how it consequently gave form to the family and later on to the city-state. This domestic religion constituted Western society's foremost building block, the family. The Indo-European, ancient Greek and Italian family, conceived as the first form of society when the inhabitants of ancient Greece and Italy had recently turned to sedentary life, owed its principles to this religion and all of its institutions derived from it. In the next episode, we'll see how the religious aristocratic family comes into existence in a world marked with clan rivalry, and how the path towards the appearance of city-states begins to take shape. Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We would receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share it if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe.